The British and Irish Lions have played just 35 tours in 137 years, but their impact on the history of rugby is immeasurable. Let's trace how the Lions evolved from their unofficial beginnings in 1888 through the key moments that transformed them into the legendary touring side we know today. The first British and Irish Lions tour wasn't known to be that at the time. The term Lions wouldn't be used in an official capacity until the 1950s, but multiple tours went on before that. The first took place in 1888 and was dubbed by many the Shaw and Shrewsbury Tour, named after Alfred Shaw and Arthur Shrewsbury, along with James Lillywhite, who were professional cricket players who wanted to take a group of rugby football players down to Australia and New Zealand and repeat what they had done the year before with a cricket team, but hopefully this time it would be a greater financial success. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Costing Shrewsbury over £6,000 up front, he would come home about £600 down, which is around £67,000 today. The team was mainly made up of English players and was called the English Footballers by the Australian media, despite them having representatives from Ireland, Wales and Scotland too. The tour wasn't officially sanctioned by the RFU, any of the other unions, or the brand new IRFB, now World Rugby. Due to this, many of Britain and Ireland's top players didn't go on the tour, and only 4 players had either already played for their countries or would go on to do so. The captain Bob Seddon, Andrew Stoddart and Tom Kent for England, and Willie Thomas for Wales. Even though it wasn't officially sanctioned, the RFU were happy for the tour to go ahead as long as it kept within the amateur ethos of the game. Due to Shrewsbury and Shaw's life as professional sportsmen, they didn't fully understand how seriously the RFU would take professionalism and handed out £15 to players to get kit for the tour. The president of Dewsbury RFC got wind of this after tourist Jack Clowes would play against his side for Halifax and appealed their result with the RFU, citing that Halifax was playing a professional. Clowes admitted to the £15 payment and offered to pay it back, but was banned by the RFU from playing. He didn't hear the news until he had already left on the tour and was unable to play in any of the matches. But how did the president of Dewsbury find out about Clowes' payment? Well, one of his players had also been paid, who was strangely absent from the match in dispute. Clowes' ban was lifted after the tour ended, but only partially because the Yorkshire Union had not allowed any tourists to play on their return until their professional status had been resolved. But there was one problem. Many of the tourists had actually been paid, and some up to £200. which is over £22,000 in today's money, one of which was star England cricketer Andrew Stoddart, who the RFU didn't want to upset. So all the tourists had to do to prove they weren't professionals was sign a declaration saying that they weren't, and they were all allowed to return to play. Jack Clowes' ban was lifted as not to appear to be favouring upper class players over the working class. The Clowes affair led to much stricter enforcement of amateurism, particularly for working class players, which was one of many incidents that led to the creation of what would become the Rugby League in 1895. 2/3 of the tourists played for clubs that would leave the RFU and join the new league. But anyway, on the 9th of March 1888, the 21-man squad boarded the SS Kaikoura in Gravesend, before making a stop in London and Plymouth, then heading off to New Zealand via Tenerife and Cape Town. They arrived in Dunedin 42 days later on the 20th of April and played the first ever tour game against Otago 8 days after, winning 8-3, despite their lack of practice due to only having a week to train, along with losing their practice balls overboard on the journey over. The tourists were very successful, playing 35 games of rugby across New Zealand and Australia, winning 27, drawing 6 and losing only 2. No tests were played on this first tour, but they did play 19 games of Victorian rules football, now called Aussie rules, winning 6 of them despite the lack of experience. But it wasn't all fun and games on the tour. Tragically, Captain Bob Seddon wouldn't return home with the rest of his team, drowning in a sculling accident on the 15th of August on the Hunter River. The tourists in 2013 visited his gravesite as a mark of respect for the first ever Lions captain. The captaincy was passed over to Andrew Stoddart for the remainder of the tour until the team returned home on the 11th of November 1888. The next tour was in 1891, but they didn't return to Australia and New Zealand. They went to South Africa after an invite from the Western Province Rugby Union. This tour would have a slight but important change. It would be officially sanctioned by the RFU, meaning that more higher quality players were willing to go on the tour, with about half of them either already having or would gain caps for their countries. Again, the team was composed of mainly English players, and was called the England team despite there being Scots on the tour, with one being Captain Bill McLagan. Only later would the term British Isles be used to describe the tourists. The tourists were decided by a committee set up by the RFU, and on the 9th of July, the team set off for Cape Town. This tour would see the first test match that the tourists would play, which would also be South Africa's first ever test match too, 19 years before South Africa would become a political entity. The Lions were extremely successful, winning all 3 tests and only conceding 1 try on the tour, which was in their first game against Cape Town. Their hardest non-test game was against Griqualand West, only winning by 3 points, which the Lions decided to award a special gift to at the end of the tour. The Lions had been given a cup by the owner of Union Castle Lines, the shipping company who took them to South Africa. He gave them one instruction: give this cup to the best team you play. That man's name was Donald Curry, and this was the Curry Cup. After Griqualand West had been awarded the trophy, they handed it over to the South African Rugby Board, and it has been played for between sides in South Africa ever since. The British and Irish Lions have had quite an impact on South African rugby these days. The next tour would once again be to South Africa in 1896, where the tourists won 19 of 21 games, including the 4 test matches, to win the test series. This tour was notable as it was the first time a large cohort of Irish players would take part. Ireland won the Home Nations Championship that year, and thus 9 of their players went on the tour to South Africa. In this tour, South Africa scored their first ever try in test history, and Warwickshire player James Byrne scored 100 points, which wouldn't be done in any tour to South Africa again by any team until Don Clark would beat it in the 1960s for New Zealand. The next tour would take place 4 years later in 1899, when they returned to Australia. But this wasn't the original plan. It was originally going to take place in 1898, but was cancelled as the tourists couldn't put a team together due to many of the players still being in term time at university. And while planning to rearrange the tour to 1899, South Africa once again came back asking for the team to tour there. The tour to South Africa was declined, but when telling the New South Wales Rugby Union about this, there was some confusion as they thought they were cancelling the tour to Australia instead. However, by the end of February 1899, everything had been sorted out and the tour to Australia went ahead. The tourists wore blue, white and red hoops, as they had done in the previous tours, which England created a modern version of that they wore in 1999 against Australia to mark the 100th anniversary of the tour and 100 years of the Australian national rugby team, as Australia had never played an international test match before their 13-3 win in the first test in 1899. The tourists would go on to win the other 3 tests and win the series 3-1. The 1903 tour would be the tourists' first real failure, as they lost the series to South Africa 1-0 by drawing 2 games and South Africa winning the last, which they seemingly took to heart, as less than 12 months later there was a team on a boat to Australia and New Zealand to try and make amends for their South African failures. It started well as they whitewashed the Australians in all games including test matches, but they were unable to keep that up in New Zealand by losing 3 non-test games and the 1 test they played. This was a notable tour on 2 accounts, as it would be the first time they would play Australia and New Zealand in the same tour, and also the last time until 1989 that Australia would be the main competitor. Every tour between those 2 would see Australia tacked onto a longer tour in New Zealand. The next tour in 1908 went back to Australia and New Zealand, but no Irish or Scottish players went, and thusly was often referred to as the Anglo-Welsh tour. It was also not popular in Wales, as all the Welsh players were picked from upper class backgrounds, and didn't represent the working man culture of Welsh rugby. It was such an issue that the WRU demanded that for the next tour, players' social class must not be taken into account. They lost a test series against New Zealand 2-0 and drawing the other, and didn't play tests against Australia, who would go on tour to the UK and win the Olympics rugby event that year. In 1910, something interesting happened, as the tourists went to Argentina for the first time. In classic fashion, it was said to be the England rugby team, despite there being 3 Scots, but the locals called it Combinado Britannico, combined British at the time, so thanks guys, appreciate it. But this tour is important in more than it being the first time the Lions would tour a place that isn't Australia, South Africa or New Zealand, but it would also be the first time Argentina would play a test match. Argentina are now one of the best teams in the world, currently sitting 5th in the world rankings at the time of recording, have reached 3 Rugby World Cup semi-finals and play in the Rugby Championship every year with their touring destination brothers in Australia, New Zealand and South Africa. That's 3 Rugby Championship sides that's first test matches were against the Lions. The tourists won every game on this tour, and it's considered one of what's referred to as the 3 lost tours, with the other 2 being 1927 and 1936. I'm not quite sure as to why they're called that, outside of them being the only times the Lions haven't toured one of Australia, New Zealand and South Africa, except for this one in 1910 as it actually clashed with another more official tour to South Africa in the same year, which was also important as it was the first time that the tour was officially operated by all of the WRU, RFU, IRFU and SRU, and the team was selected by a committee consisting of members from all 4 unions. South Africa would win the series 2-1. The next tour wouldn't be until 14 years later in 1924, due to the outbreak of World War I. They went back to South Africa and were once again unsuccessful, losing 3 of 4 tests and drawing the 4th. But this tour would be notable as it was the first time Lions was used by a journalist to describe the team after the team arrived with the rampant Lion of Scotland taking off the British coat of arms on their ties. The name stuck. In 1927, they went to Argentina for a more official tour this time, and they took a much stronger squad than in 1910, with 15 players either having already played for their country or who would in the future. This is also the first time Argentina would wear their famous blue and white striped jersey. The tourists played 9 games, including 4 tests, and won every match. Over the next 3 tours, in 1930 to New Zealand and Australia, 1936 to Argentina, and 1938 to South Africa, the tourists would only win the Argentina Test Series, which would also be the last time the Lions would tour Argentina, and they wouldn't meet again until they played in Cardiff in 2005. By the time of the 1938 tour, the term Lions had become a fairly universal nickname for the touring side. But this would be the last tour before the outbreak of World War II, and when the next tour took place in 1950 to New Zealand and Australia, the term Lions became official. This was also when the Lions adopted the full red shirt, as in most of the previous tours, they would wear a jersey that was often a mix between red, white and blue. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the Lions tours continued, with the main interesting tidbits being the unofficial matches against Cardiff RFC in 1951 and Wales 15 in 1955, which saw many previous and future Lions play against the Lions for the first time. And how big the 1955 tour was, with massive public support and a 95,000 capacity crowd at Ellis Park, which cemented the Lions as part of the rugby calendar. There's also a weird myth suggesting that Idi Amin, the infamous military dictator of Uganda, was a replacement for East Africa when the Lions played them. However, this is completely unfounded, as he doesn't appear in the team photo, and replacements weren't really a thing in rugby until about 15 years later. The tours came and went in these decades, and most of these series results were the same: losing or drawing to South Africa, beating Australia, and losing to New Zealand. In 1966, John Robbins became the first head coach of the Lions, and they also played Canada in a test match on their return home. By 1971, one of the greatest moments in Lions history would happen. They returned to Australia and New Zealand, disappointing in their opening match against Queensland, but they would go on to win their next 15 matches in a row, including the first test against New Zealand, 9-3, but their record made them overconfident going into the second test, where New Zealand would take advantage of their brashness and went on to humble them 22-12. The series now stood at 1-1 going into the third game, but the Lions didn't make the same mistake in the third test, winning it 13-3 and again leading the series now 2-1. There was one last game, and all the Lions had to do was not lose for a first famous victory in New Zealand. The match was sitting even at 11-all, but the Lions were pulled ahead by a famous 45-metre drop goal by JPR Williams, the only drop goal in the player's career to make it 14-11. And importantly so, as the All Blacks won a penalty to even up 14-all, and that's how the game would end, and the Lions would win their first ever series in New Zealand 2-1. To this day, this is the only time the Lions have won a series in New Zealand. The next tour in 1974 to South Africa was successful if not controversial, as many sporting organisations, including the Olympics, had banned South Africa from participation in their events due to their apartheid policies. The UN had described apartheid as a crime against humanity, and only months after the tour finished, they were suspended from participating in the General Assembly, with massive pressure having been put on rugby to stop playing South Africa by activist groups. Multiple players refused to go on the tour. The Lions won the series 3-0 with one draw, but it's perhaps more well known for the infamous 99 call. The Lions had theorised that the South Africans dominated their opposition with physical violence and decided to retaliate with a one-in, all-in approach, which meant if one player got in a fight with a Bok, every player did. Or you would just turn around and hit the nearest Bok next to you. Doing so meant the referee would be unable to identify any single player and would be unable to punish them. The 99 call was originally called the 999 call, the emergency service number in the UK, but was altered as it was too slow to say on the pitch. This culminated in the Battle of Boat Erasmus Stadium, one of the most violent games in rugby history. In 1977, the Lions returned to New Zealand, winning all but one non-test game, which was the first loss the Lions had to their name since they lost the second test against New Zealand in 1971. They wouldn't repeat their feats of that tour, however, and would lose the series 3-1. On their way home, they stopped in Suva and played a match against the hosts Fiji, where they lost 25-21. Their tour may have been over with this defeat, but they still had one more match to play, against the Babas at Twickenham. This was the Lions' first official home match, having played 2 unofficial games in the 50s. The Lions won 23-14 and raised over £100,000 for charity. The tour to South Africa in 1980 would once again come under scrutiny, but this time from more official opposition, as both the British and Irish governments opposed the tour. The UK was part of the Gleneagles Agreement from 1977, which saw all Commonwealth nations agree to discourage sporting contact with South Africa until the end of apartheid. But the tour went on ahead despite the condemnation. South Africa would win the series 3-1, and in 1983, the Lions wouldn't fare much better in New Zealand, when they were whitewashed in the Test series 4-0, which was only the second time it had happened in their history, with the first happening in 1966 against the same opposition. Head coach Jim Telfer considered packing it in at the time and retiring from rugby, but he was convinced to stay with Scotland for one more Five Nations campaign, where he would spectacularly lead them to only their second ever Grand Slam. He retired from coaching after that, but he wouldn't be able to stay away for long, being Sir Ian McGeechan's assistant for Scotland's 1990 Grand Slam and the 1997 Lions Tour. In 1986, the tour schedule was broken as the Lions didn't tour South Africa due to finally partaking in the sports boycott. But this didn't mean they didn't play. To celebrate the 100th anniversary of the IRB, now World Rugby, the Lions played against the rest, who were players from the other 4 IRB members, France, South Africa, New Zealand and Australia, who won the game 15-7. Crazy how there were only 8 nations officially recognised by the sport's governing body at the time. A lot of players from these 8 nations didn't even get caps for playing teams outside the IRFB. Scotland has recently been retroactively giving players the caps that they earned for representing their country. In 1989, the Lions went back on tour for the first time since 1983, and toured Australia for the first time since 1971, and the first time without New Zealand in 90 years. They lost the first test against the Wallabies 30-12, a record defeat against Australia, but the Lions came back to win the next 2 tests. This Australia team would go on to win the World Cup 2 years later in 1991. The Lions finished off the tour by beating an Anzac 15, but this wouldn't be their last game that year. Just like in 1977, they would play another game outside of the tour, but not in Twickenham or against the Babas. This time, they would play France at their home in Paris. The match was uncapped for both sides, and was part of the celebrations for the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. The Lions won 29-27. The next tour would be the start of the 4-year tour cycles, as we still see today. Between 1966 and 1989, it was every 3 years. This would also be the last tour of the amateur era, but obviously the tourists didn't know that at the time. The Lions lost the series against New Zealand 2-1 and were coached by Sir Ian McGeechan and Dick Best. Great name. The next series in 1997 would be the first Lions tour of South Africa since the end of apartheid, and was the first of this new professional era. People didn't really know if the Lions would fit into a professional sport, so it was vital the Lions won the series, as a loss may have made the unions decide to focus on their own teams and end the Lions altogether. There was no room for error, and the coaches knew that, led by Sir Ian McGeechan with his 1990 Grand Slam coaching partner Jim Telfer, who wanted to do right by his failure in 1983, and under them the team flourished. The Lions won emphatically, only losing 2 games on the tour and winning the series against the world champions 2-1 in the final test. This tour also saw the start of the behind-the-scenes programming with the famous Living with the Lions documentary, which let some of the players' great characters shine and let the fans have a closer connection to the tourists.
Mistaken identity.
The Lions still produce content like this, and I post a lot of it on their social media pages throughout the tour. You should really watch it, it's some great stuff. The next series was in 2001, the first of the new millennia, and they were once again playing the world champions, but this time it was Australia. This was the first time the Lions played for a trophy, the Tom Richards Trophy, which the Wallabies would win by beating the Lions 2-1 in what was actually their first ever series win against the Lions 113 years after the tour that started it all in 1888. The next tour was in 2005, and off the back of England's 2003 World Cup win, and Clive Woodward, the man who led them to that title, leading the Lions, People were hoping the Lions could do a repeat of what they did in 1971 and win a series in New Zealand. But seemingly, nobody told the Lions that. The first match wasn't in New Zealand, but in Cardiff against Los Pumas, which was the first time the Lions played Argentina since 1936. But they wouldn't come away successful, as the game finished a 25-all draw, which wasn't a test match at the time, but was retroactively given test status by the IRB in 2008. When the Lions arrived in New Zealand, they won 7 of their non-test matches, including a 109-6 victory over Manawatu, midweek between the first and second tests. But they would lose to the New Zealand Maori as one of their warm-ups, and got embarrassed in the test series, losing all 3 tests, and conceding a combined 107 points and only scoring 40. But there was more drama in these tests than that. In the first minute of the opening test, after Captain Brian O'Driscoll made a tackle and attempted to counter-ruck, he was picked up by Kevin Mialamu and Tana Umaga, tilted over the horizontal and dangerously dropped on the top of his shoulders. Brian O'Driscoll was ruled out for the remainder of the tests, and neither player faced punishment for their actions. Many years later, the referee of the match said it would have warranted a red card if he had seen the actions take place. The poor results on this tour, combined with the series defeat in 2001, had many starting to ask questions about whether the Lions could survive professionalism. In 2009, the Lions returned to South Africa and brought back the coach who led them to victory in 1997, Sir Ian McGeechan. Once again, South Africa were world champions, having lifted the Webb Ellis Cup in 2007. The series was closely fought, with South Africa only winning the first test by 5 points. Come the second test, the Lions were leading after 60 minutes, 19-8. But tries by Brian Habana and Jack Fourie brought South Africa back into the game, and in the dying minutes, the game was tied 25-all. Replacement Ronan O'Gara kicked for a contestable high ball and took out Fourie Dupree and gave away a penalty in a kickable distance from goal. And Springbok fly half Morney Steyn stepped up to win the second test 28-5 and win the series for South Africa. The Lions would win the final test, but it was all over by then. There was some controversy in this tour, however. In the second test, Schalkberger was yellow carded for making contact to the face and eye area. Lions players, fans and pundits weren't happy about this, as they thought it should have been a red. After the match, he was cited and banned for 8 weeks. But more bizarrely was Bakkies Botha receiving a 2-week ban for a dangerous clear out on Adam Jones that led to his shoulder being dislocated. SA Rugby described the clear out as textbook and appealed the ban. When it was upheld, they expressed their concern about how this could impact core areas of the game. Lions coach Warren Gatland and Adam Jones both came out in defence of Botha. During the third test, the Springboks wore white armbands with Justice 4 written on them, and were fined for bringing the game into disrepute. This tour also saw the debut of the Southern Kings, who would go on to play in Super Rugby and the Pro 14 before being disbanded in 2020. On the next tour in 2013, the Lions would play the Babas for the first time since 1977, when they met them in Hong Kong on their way to Australia, and won 59-8. This would be the first time that current tourist Elliot Daly would have involvement in the Lions, as he lined up against them for the Barbarians. In 2025, he will be on his third Lions tour. Warren Gatland, who had been in McGeechan's coaching staff in 2009, would lead the tourists as head coach. The Lions would beat Australia in the first test by a narrow 2-point margin, and were winning by 6 points with 6 minutes to go in the second test. But a try by Adam Ashley Cooper, which was successfully converted, would win the day for Australia. It was all to play for in the third test. And some big calls were made, with Brian O'Driscoll being controversially dropped and replaced with Jonathan Davies. But the choice was vindicated as the Lions won the game 46-16, winning their first tour in 16 years and first in Australia in 24 years. The Lions lost only one non-test match, losing to the Brumbies 14-12. The Lions returned to New Zealand in 2017, once again with hopes of getting a second series win. In their warm-ups, they would lose to both the Blues and Highlanders and draw to the Hurricanes 31-all between the first and second tests. New Zealand would take the first test, with a comfortable 30-15 win over the tourists, and it was starting to look more like a whitewash could happen than a series win for the Lions. Lions captain Sam Warburton had lost his spot for the game, becoming the first tour captain not to play the opening test in 87 years, but he returned at 6 in the second test and led the Lions to a 24-21 victory to tie the series 1-1. This match was notable for the sending off of Sonny Bill Williams, which was New Zealand's first red card since they started using the card system, with the previous All Black sent-off being Colin Mead against Scotland in 1967. 50 years between sending offs is one hell of a stat. This wasn't the only controversy of the tour, as there was a group of players called up dubbed the Geography Six, who were called up as replacements on the 17th of June. The 6 were Kristen Dacey, Gareth Davies, Alan Dell, Thomas Francis, Corey Hill and Finn Russell. This was notable as it was perceived that these players were only called up due to being on tours with their national teams playing in nations that were geographically close to New Zealand. They were not seen as the next players in line based purely on talent, and the media criticised Gatland for devaluing the Lions jersey. This led to Gatland actively picking other squad members over them for some games. And this wasn't the end of it, as the third test was marred in controversy too. The two sides were drawing 50-0 going into the dying moments, and the referee Romain Poit blew for a penalty for New Zealand in a kickable distance. It looked like it was all over for the Lions, but after discussions with his assistant, the referee changed his call and awarded a scrum instead. But dramatically, the Lions were able to come away with the ball before New Zealand found possession again, and in the Lions' corner, they were pushed out of play, and the game ended 15-15 with a series draw. Come the next tour in 2021, the world was in a different place. With the outbreak of COVID-19 in 2020, there were rumours that the tour to South Africa might be cancelled or delayed until 2022. Other options were on the table too. Australia offered to host a tour for South Africa and the Lions, like they had done for the Rugby Championship in 2020 and were doing again in 2021. There was also the potential of having a home tour where it would be hosted in the UK, as by the summer of 2021, the UK was mostly out of lockdown and had the spread more under control and a faster vaccine rollout than South Africa did at that point. But it was decided after massive backlash and thousands of fans signing a petition that the tour would go ahead as planned, except all games would be played behind closed doors. Due to this, instead of travelling all across the country, the games were played only at Ellis Park, Loftus Versfield and Cape Town Stadium. But the first match was actually at Murrayfield, which was the Lions' first ever game in Scotland, was the only game played with a crowd, with 16,500 spectators being allowed into the stadium. The Lions won 28-10 in their first ever match against Japan. Their first match was meant to be against a South African invitational side, but was cancelled to reduce the risk of a COVID outbreak, and the Lions played the Lions instead. Not themselves, the Emirates Lions of Johannesburg. The Lions would also play the Sharks twice, as their match with the Bulls was cancelled due to an outbreak within their squad, so the Sharks stepped up and took their place. The Lions won every non-test game except the match against South Africa A, which, let's be honest, was basically an unofficial fourth test, which they lost 17-13. But the first test, the Lions would come away narrow victors, with a 22-17 win in Cape Town. South Africa, however, would come back with vengeance in the second test, comfortably beating the Lions 27-9. The series was now tied 1-1, and it all came down to the final test. In a close-fought battle, which saw the two teams drawing in the dying minutes, the Lions would give up a penalty, and who but the man himself, Morney Steyn, who kicked the winning point in the 2009 series, stepped up to do the same again, and won the match 19-6 for the world champions, who took the series 2-1. Funnily enough, the Lions have only played South Africa as world champions since it became possible after the first World Cup in 1987. But there was also some drama here too. After the first test match, Springbok director of rugby, Rassie Erasmus, released an hour-long video criticising the officiating of the first test match. The referee described how much distress it caused him and described the video as a character assassination. Erasmus received a 2-month ban from all rugby activities and a 10-month ban from stadium activities. The 2025 campaign kicked off in Dublin with the Lions playing Argentina, and finally beat the Lions 115 years after that first match. They then travelled to Australia and started the tour with a match against Western Force. They will play their first test against Australia on the 19th of July with the hopes that they can win another test series against the Wallabies, who have had it rough for the last couple of years. If you want to learn more about their disastrous 2023 World Cup campaign, you can check this video out right here. Thanks for watching.